The NRHS ran a Fantrip on the CP to Orangeville. It was impossible to run a steam Fantrip out of the Buffalo area on the railroads in the States, so we came to Canada. This was unique in that it had 6 different locomotives, 2 Mikados coming up from Hamilton, 2 10-wheelers from Streetsville to Orangeville and back, and 2 Pacifics back down to Hamilton. And I might add diesels back to Buffalo. The 700-odd fans on the Fantrip really enjoyed the countryside, and obviously the spectators standing on the roads enjoyed watching the train go by. In Orangeville, they uncoupled the locomotives to take water. Those lucky few had a chance of a lifetime to ride the tender of a steam engine at the end of an era. Today, this would never be permitted by the operating rules. Back at Streetsville, the 10-wheelers were removed from the train and the Pacifics were coupled on for the trip back to Hamilton. The 5405 was handling an eastbound freight at Guelph. The 2414, waiting at Valence, was heading west. The 5405 was about to expire its flue time. The engineer was having trouble maintaining power. The train needed help, so the 2 engines got together and both started the train. They later separated, and then the 5405 continued east, later followed by the 2414 westbound. When the 2414 arrived at Galt, it switched some cars and interchanged freight with the electrified Lake Erie Northern Grand River Railroad, a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific. Of course, this was all in competition with the growing truck traffic, which principally eliminated branch line service in later years. Three of us went to Montreal to ride behind 144. One of my friends convinced us to take a Canadian Pacific pool train. Unfortunately, that night, on the way to Montreal, some man came down a side road at Bowmansville and hit the side of the train. We didn't make Smith Falls until 1 o'clock. On Sunday, we rode the train from Montreal to Cornwall. 144 was one of the 3 engines that operated in New Brunswick because of a bridge restriction. 29 and 136 were the other locomotives. The cars were interesting. One of them was even lit with gas. They called it pinch gas. I think it was acetylene. For such a small engine, it performed very well. I was quite impressed, actually. And they ran some very nice photo runs. Backed up quite a long ways, came by, lots of smoke. And they picked good locations. You remember, this was kind of the end of the normal operating era of steam in Canada. One of the advantages of a spring-wound camera that I had, you didn't have to worry about battery failure in the extreme cold. When I got done with this trip, I knew what a Canadian winter was like. You might get a lot of snow in Hamburg, where I come from, but Canadian winters, wow. In 1960, regular steam service on the Canadian Pacific had ended. There were a few locomotives left for service, and a Fantrip was operated in March of 1960 to Port McNicoll. Here we are passing the Spadina Roundhouse of the Canadian National. Look at all the dead steam engines, never to run again. Most of them will be cut up in the next year. Look at that beautiful station at West Toronto, an architectural masterpiece. We stopped there to pick up extra passengers. The CP was very cooperative. Not only did the train have nicely outfitted coaches, but full dining cars, and the food was superb. The weather broke, luckily. The sun came out for a while. Makes for great pictures. They had a few photo runs on the way up to Port McNicoll. And it was great to see that beautiful engine operating like it did in early times. And the engineer certainly knew what a photo run was too. Lots of smoke, great sounds, just awe-inspiring. Some of us even rode the baggage cars with the open doors in order to hear the sound of the engine. At Port McNicoll, there's an unusually long wooden trestle, and they use this location for quite a nice photo run. After turning the locomotive on the turntable, we returned to Toronto. On May 1st of 1960, an unusual Fantrip was operated by Railfans Unlimited. There was 3 locomotives, 136, an American type of 440, and 2 10-wheels. Operated from Toronto, stopped at West Toronto, pictured here for additional passengers, and went to Orangeburg. Engine 136 eventually found a home at Tottenham, Ontario, at the South Central Railway. 1057, the last locomotive pictured here, is also located at Tottenham. run was operated at the Forks of the Credit River, scenic location. Quite a high bridge, but there were so many railroad fans on that trip, probably 700 to 800, that it was extremely difficult to get a good position. So you picked the best place you could. As you can see, there's bodies all over the place. In Orangeville, a throng greeted us. There were probably 500 people just wanting to see the train come into town. Locomotive 815 was scrapped shortly after the trip, but the other two, thank goodness, survived today. A couple of months later, the NRHS Buffalo chapter operated a fan trip from Hamilton to Toronto and then west on the main line to Galt. 2857 was again in service, and later two old friends, 1057 and 2414, handled the train from Toronto to Galt and return. One of the things that happened on this trip was kind of interesting. One of our members had a Lehigh Valley whistle. They put it on the 1057. They were going to use the whistle exclusively, but I told the engineer on the 2414 to blow the whistle also, which he did. Unfortunately, at the same time that the engineer on the 1057 was blowing the whistle, so he overpowered the Lehigh Valley sound. But I never told anybody I did that. We had about 800 passengers on this fan trip, quite successful. It was a moneymaker for us, and I'm sure all of the people on the train enjoyed the photo run that they had at Lambton Yard with the 2857. You can see how popular our train was with all the cars along the road to the lake at Campbellville. It must have been a great sight to see it and hear it recorded on film. There was a final photo run at Guelph Junction. I stood on a signal bridge to get an advantage. It was quite a neat shot. The next section will be my movies taken on the Canadian National during the same time period of like 1952 to 1960. The steam fan today can still enjoy the sights and sounds of steam locomotives at chartered railroad operations, and the Canadian Pacific did save some locomotives for static display. Railway Recollections Part 5, we will show operations on the Canadian National covering both main line and branch lines.